It was the kind of cold that wrapped around the bones, not from the weather, but from the silence of being truly alone. The streets were empty, slick with rain that had long turned to mist, blurring the glow of distant traffic lights like a half-forgotten dream. Her steps were uneven, one hand gripping the small of her back, while the other clutched the frayed strap of a dirty canvas bag. Inside it, all she owned, a change of clothes, an old blanket wrapped around a pacifier she'd found at a shelter weeks ago, and the ultrasound photo she hadn't looked at in days. Her belly was heavy and low, her shoes soaked through, the fabric of her coat torn under the arm, let in every gust of wind like punishment. She didn't know where she was anymore, not exactly. The city had blurred into shadows and indistincts. Corners ever since she ran. All she knew was that she couldn't stop, not now. Not until she was somewhere no one would find her. Especially him. She hadn't planned it. If she had, maybe she would have packed more food or tried to keep her phone charged. But the last time he'd hit her, something shifted. Not in her body. Bruises were familiar, but in her mind. In that moment, while lying on the kitchen floor, tasting metal in her mouth and listening to him yell about dinner being cold, she'd realized something terrifying and pure. Her baby would be born into this, into screaming and slammed doors and footsteps that made you hold your breath. She couldn't let that happen. Not to this child. Not to any child. So she waited until he was asleep, took what she could carry, and walked into the dark. That was 3 days ago, or maybe 4. Time had become slippery. It didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was finding somewhere to give birth, somewhere quiet, somewhere safe, somewhere he wouldn't think to look. Her contractions had started earlier that day, small and far apart. She had ignored them, convinced herself it was false. Labor, just nerves and cold and hunger. But now, as another one gripped her from the inside and forced her to stop walking and lean against a crumbling wall, she knew it was real. It was starting, and she had no one to call, no address to go to, no hospital that wouldn't ask questions she couldn't answer. She had no documents, no prenatal records, and a deep, reasonable fear that the moment she stepped into any official building, she'd lose everything, her baby, her last thread of dignity, maybe even her freedom. She wasn't willing to risk it. Not again, not after all this. That's when she saw it. An old church, or what used to be one, set back from the road, partly hidden by trees whose branches clawed at the sky like broken fingers. Its roof sagged in the middle, windows shattered, door hanging off its hinges. But it was shelter. And to her, in that moment, it looked like mercy. She crossed the empty lot slowly, each step more painful than the last. The rain had turned to a light drizzle, and the mud sucked at her shoes like it wanted her to stay. She pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The air was damp and cold, but it didn't smell like rot, just dust and memory. Her breath echoed in the emptiness. Pews still lined the room, though some were toppled or split down the middle. The altar was cracked. The stained glass was long gone. But there was a roof and walls, and quiet. She sat, down on the floor near the back, behind the last row of pews, pulling the blanket from her bag and folding it over itself to soften the cold stone. She lowered herself onto it slowly, trying to stay calm, trying not to think of all the things that could go wrong if she delivered here alone. She rubbed her stomach, whispered that it would be okay, even if she didn't believe it. She had no idea how to give birth by herself, no idea what to do when the baby came. But the thought of turning back, of asking for help and being told she was unfit or unstable or irresponsible, that was more terrifying than anything else. The next contraction came harder and she cried out without meaning to. Her voice bounced off the ruined walls and disappeared into the rafters. She bit her sleeve to muffle the next one. Tears sprang to her eyes, not from the pain, but from the sudden understanding that she might not survive this. And if she didn't, what would happen to the baby? Would someone find them in time? Would anyone care? She looked around the abandoned space, the broken benches and peeled paint, and whispered through clenched teeth, "Please, just help me. Someone. Anyone." But there was no answer. Just wind passing through the cracks in the stone, just the faint hum of the city far beyond the trees, just the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears like a warning she could no longer ignore. She had reached the edge, and the night was only just beginning. The pain was no longer something she could reason with. It came in waves now, like a tide crashing over her with no rhythm, no mercy, no room to breathe. Her hands trembled as she pushed herself up from the floor, fighting the weight of her body and the dull nausea that rose in her throat. She couldn't stay here. Not like this, not without help. She thought she could do it alone. She told herself over and over again that she had no choice, that she was stronger than she felt, that the world might be cruel, but she had survived worse. But nothing had prepared her for this, for the blinding helplessness of labor with no one beside her, for the sound of her own sobs echoing through an abandoned church that no longer held the power to comfort. With her arms wrapped around her stomach, she staggered toward the broken door and stepped back into the rain. The drizzle had stopped, but the sky remained swollen with gray, pressing down on the street like a secret waiting to break. A few blocks away, there were houses. She had seen them when she arrived, modest little homes with sagging porches and overgrown lawns, probably forgotten in some corner of the city that time no longer cared to visit. But people lived there. There had to be someone who would look past her wet clothes and swollen belly and just help. She took the first step with a sharp gasp, her feet dragging through puddles as she walked along the uneven sidewalk. Her breath came in short bursts, one hand on her hip, the other steadying herself against a fence. She reached the first house and knocked. No response. She knocked again, louder. A curtain shifted in the window. Then nothing. She backed away and moved to the next house. This time, a porch light flicked on. She felt a sliver of hope rise, held onto it like a child, but it vanished as quickly as it came. A man's voice barked from behind the door, muffled and annoyed. "No cash? Go away." She tried to explain, tried to say she wasn't asking for money, just help, just a phone, anything. But the voice grew louder, crueler, then disappeared behind the slam of a deadbolt sliding into place. She stood there for a moment, dazed. Her body was begging her to sit, to collapse, but she kept moving. Another house, another knock. A woman opened the door an inch, looked at her belly, then her face, then said quietly, "I'm sorry. I can't get involved," and closed it, just like that. Not angry, not cruel, just detached, like she wasn't a person, just a risk, a problem, a headline waiting to happen. That rejection hurt the most, the calm, polite refusal to see her. By the fifth house, she couldn't speak through the pain. She just knocked and leaned against the doorframe, her head against the peeling paint, whispering, "Please, please, please." No one answered. Lights turned off as she approached. One man stepped outside and saw her in the street, doubled over, and simply turned around and went back inside. She wanted to scream, not from pain, but from the ache of invisibility. How could they not see her? How could they look at her and turn away? She sank to her knees near a mailbox, one hand pressed to the ground, the other on her belly. She couldn't go any further. Her legs wouldn't carry her. She had no more words left to beg with. The world had closed every door it had, and now all that was left was stone and sky. She stayed there for several minutes, shivering, until the cold from the ground began to crawl up her spine. Then slowly, she pulled herself up using a fence post and began the long walk back to the church, back to silence, back to the cracked walls and broken pews, and the place where she would have to give birth alone. By the time she reached the front steps again, her vision was blurred from exhaustion. She stepped inside, lowered herself back onto the blanket, and curled on her side. Her hands were scraped from the fall earlier, her knees soaked with mud. Her breath trembled in her throat. She had nothing left to ask for, nothing left to hope for. She looked up at the crumbling ceiling and tried to imagine her baby's face. She couldn't. All she could feel was the fear. What if the baby came? Breach? What if the cord was wrapped? What if she started bleeding and couldn't stop? She pulled the old blanket over her chest and whispered one more time into the still air, her voice hoarse and fragile. "Please, don't let me die like this." The church remained silent. No miracle, no light from above, just the quiet groan of wood settling and the distant growl of thunder somewhere far beyond the city. She closed her eyes, her body curling inward, bracing for the next wave. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she began to say goodbye. The storm outside had settled into a low, steady rhythm, tapping gently against the broken windows and warped wooden beams as if the sky itself was too tired to rage any longer. Inside the church, the silence had thickened. It felt ancient, almost sacred, but not in the comforting way she remembered from childhood. This silence was heavier, more honest, the kind that doesn't pretend things will be okay, the kind that simply holds you while the world forgets. She lay on her side, breathing through her teeth, her arms wrapped tightly around her belly as if trying to hold the child in, to delay the inevitable. The pain came now with an urgency she could no longer rationalize. Her thighs shook with each contraction. Her mouth was dry, her body was beginning to turn inward, and somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew that meant it was close, too close. She opened her eyes slowly, looking toward the open doorway of the church, now framed in shadow. The rain had stopped. The air hung still and damp, and in the distance there was a sound she couldn't quite place. Not wind, not an engine, something softer, closer. Then it came again, footsteps squelching in the wet gravel, careful, hesitant. And then a voice. Hello? It wasn't loud. It wasn't threatening. It sounded almost embarrassed, like someone who wasn't sure if they were allowed to speak at all. She tensed, her whole body rigid. Her first instinct was fear. Always. Fear? Had he found her? Was this some cruel trick of fate circling her back into his hands just when she was too weak to run? She tried to sit up but couldn't. She could only listen. "Is someone in there?" the voice asked again. Male, rough but not cruel. He sounded young but tired, that kind of tired that sinks into a person's bones. She didn't answer, couldn't. She waited, breath shallow, and after a few seconds he stepped into the light. His clothes were soaked. His beard was uneven, patchy. His eyes darted around the space like a frightened animal. He held no bag, no weapon, nothing but a broken umbrella tucked under one arm. When he saw her lying behind the pew, he froze. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, holding up his hands. "I didn't know anyone was here. I just needed somewhere dry." She didn't speak. Her body was too far gone in pain, and her mind was still locked in that place where trust had become a foreign language. He looked at her belly, at her face, and something shifted in his expression. Not pity, not panic, something quieter, recognition. You're in labor?" he asked. She nodded once, barely. He moved slowly, cautiously, as if afraid to spook her. "Do you want me to go?" he asked. She shook her head. The word no never made it out, but her eyes said it for her. She didn't want to be alone anymore. He crouched near one of the fallen benches, pulled off his soaked jacket, and placed it under her head without touching her. "I'm not a doctor or anything," he said, "but I saw a birth once, a long time ago. My cousin's wife didn't make it to the hospital in time. It was messy, but the baby came out okay. I'll stay if that's all right." She nodded again, eyes fluttering shut. For a few moments, neither of them said anything. The quiet returned, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like something had cracked open in the space between them. Not trust, not yet, but presence. A human presence that didn't demand anything from her, that didn't ask her name or why she was here or what she had done, just someone willing to sit in the dark beside her. He moved around the church, gathering whatever scraps he could find. Old cloth from under the pulpit. A bent candle holder he straightened out and lit with a match from his pocket. He pulled apart the backrest of a broken pew and laid the pieces out beside her, creating a kind of barrier between her body and the cold stone floor. He didn't ask questions. He didn't stare. Every movement was deliberate, almost reverent, like he understood that she was balancing on the edge of something sacred and terrifying. "I've been out there for a while," he said after a long silence. 2 months, maybe more. Lost my job, then the room I was renting. Family's not really an option. I've been sleeping under that bridge near the tracks, but tonight it was too wet, too cold. I saw the light from the church and thought maybe—" She looked at him now, really looked. His face was pale from the cold, hands trembling from hunger or exhaustion or both. He wasn't much more than a shadow, but in that moment he looked more human to her than anyone had in months. Another contraction tore through her and she gasped, her hand gripping the edge of the bench. He knelt beside her immediately, unsure of what to do but ready to do something. "You're close, aren't you?" he asked. Okay, I'm right here. You're not alone." She wanted to believe that, wanted to hold on to those words like a lifeline. But the fear was still there, lurking just beneath the pain. Not just fear of the birth, but fear of what came after, of what she would be. Who she would be once the baby arrived. If she made it through, but for the first time in days, maybe weeks, she wasn't the only soul in the room. Someone had answered her plea, even if it wasn't with sirens or angels or miracles. Just a man, with nothing, who still gave what little he had, a jacket, a match, a presence, and in this hollowed-out place where no prayers had been spoken in years, that might be enough. The hours blurred together, marked only by the growing intensity of the pain and the fading strength in her limbs. The small flicker of candlelight danced against the stained walls, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and shrink with every breath she took. Her body was drenched in sweat, despite the cold. Her lips were cracked and her hands trembled uncontrollably. The man stayed beside her, silent when he needed to be, speaking only when he saw her slipping into herself too deeply. Each time she gasped, he reminded her to breathe. Each time she whispered that she couldn't do this, that it was too much, he simply said, "Yes, you can. You are." But she was beginning to slip. Her head rolled back against the bench. Her eyes stayed closed longer each time. She could feel something shifting inside her, not just the baby pushing lower, but something in her blood, something in her chest. Her breathing had changed. It was shallow now, more panic than rhythm. She felt cold, but not from the floor. It was inside her. A quiet, creeping cold that began at her spine and moved outward. Her mind kept drifting. She saw things that weren't there. A white curtain blowing in a summer window, her mother's hands, the old stuffed animal she used to hold when she was afraid of storms. These fragments came and went like memories, from a fever dream, too soft to hold on to, too strong to forget. The man noticed. He had been watching her face carefully, and now something in him changed. He stood abruptly, scanning the church. "You're not okay," he said under his breath, more to himself than to her. "Something's wrong." He looked at her again. She was barely responding now. Her skin looked pale in the flickering light, her breathing short and erratic. He didn't know what to do. He had no phone, no car, no clue how to deliver a baby or what to do if things went wrong. But something in his gut told him this was no longer something he could wait through. "I'll be back," he said quickly, pulling his jacket around him. "Don't move, just hang on." She didn't answer. She didn't even open her eyes. He took one last look at her, then ran. The street was dark, but his legs moved fast. He didn't think. He didn't have time to think. He ran through the wet streets, past the empty houses, past the corner where he had once tried to sleep in the doorway of an old bakery. He ran until his lungs burned, At every house he passed, he knocked. Then he pounded, he shouted. Most lights stayed off. One door opened and slammed shut the second they saw him. Another man told him to get lost or he'd call the cops. He didn't stop. He couldn't. Finally, near the end of the block, a porch light clicked on. A woman opened the door halfway, her face lined with age and uncertainty. She started to close it when he begged. Not for himself, for her. "She's giving birth," he said, breathless. "And she's not okay. Please, she needs help. I think she's bleeding. She's in the church. Please." The woman hesitated. Then something shifted in her face. Maybe it was the word church. Maybe it was his eyes. She stepped back inside, picked up a phone, and said she was calling an ambulance. He waited just long enough to hear her give the address before he turned and ran again, back toward the broken building, back toward the flickering candle, and the girl lying on the cold floor, trying to bring a life into the world with no hands to catch it. When he returned, she was still breathing, but barely. Her body was limp, her skin wet with sweat. Blood had begun to pool beneath her. The blanket was soaked. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands shaking as he touched her face. "Hey," he whispered, "you're not done. You hear me? They're coming. Just hold on, please." Her eyes opened for a second, unfocused and distant. Then her lips moved. A single word, barely audible. "Name." He didn't understand. He leaned closer. "What?" she whispered again, slower this time. "Name. His name." He looked at her for a long second. Minutes passed. Then outside, the distant wail of sirens began to rise. The man stood, walked to the door, and waved his arms, shouting. Lights flashed. Tires skidded. Paramedics rushed in, shouting orders, assessing, lifting. She was barely conscious, the baby crowning. One of them knelt beside her, shouting for another blanket, more light. They worked fast, precise, a birth on cold stone, no monitors, no time, just hands and breath and urgency. The baby came into the world screaming, a boy, alive. They wrapped him in cloth, placed him in an incubator, and rushed the mother onto a stretcher. She had lost too much blood. Her body was cold to the touch, but she was still alive, barely. They loaded them both into the ambulance. The man stood outside, soaked in sweat and rain, his arms crossed over his chest. One paramedic turned to ask who he was, but when they looked again, he was gone. The doors closed. The sirens screamed back to life, and the church stood silent once more. The hospital was quiet, the kind of quiet that hums behind walls and waits in fluorescent lights. Machines clicked softly. Nurses moved like shadows, practiced and gentle. In a small, dim room on the far end of the maternity wing, the mother opened her eyes. It took her a moment to remember where she was. The ceiling above her was white, smooth, unfamiliar. The sheets beneath her were clean. Her arms were heavy. Her body felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else. Then she remembered the pain, the blood, the candlelight. And for one terrible second she panicked. Her voice cracked when she tried to speak. A nurse was already at her side, holding a small cup of water, speaking softly. "You're safe. You're at St. Mercy Hospital. The baby is alive. He's in the neonatal unit, but he's strong. He's breathing on his own. You made it." The mother didn't cry right away. It was too much. Her body couldn't hold the weight of all she'd feared and all that hadn't happened. Her hand drifted slowly to her stomach, now empty. She looked at the nurse, not with fear this time, but with something more fragile. Grief, relief, a silent kind of gratitude that words could only insult. She asked to see him. Later, when they wheeled in the small plastic crib and placed it beside her, she stared for a long time. He was tiny, wrapped in white, eyes closed, chest rising and falling with impossible softness. She reached out slowly and touched his fingers. They curled, instinctively around hers. That was when the tears came. quietly, without sound. They rolled down her cheeks and soaked the hospital pillow. She didn't wipe them away. She didn't ask about birth certificates or paperwork or who had signed her in. Part of her was afraid to know, afraid that any name attached to her might bring back the life she had run from. But no one questioned her. No one demanded explanations. No one threatened to take him away. The nurses called her mama and asked if she wanted to hold him. When she said yes, they placed him in her arms with care. As if she had always belonged in this moment, she asked about the man, the one who had stayed, the one who ran for help. The nurse blinked, confused. She checked the chart. There was no name listed, no emergency contact, no witness. Just the paramedic's note. Found mother inside abandoned structure. Male subject on site, refused identification. Disappeared before transport. They checked the security cameras. Nothing. He hadn't stayed long enough to be seen. That night, after the nurses dimmed the lights and the hallway sounds faded into the background hum of a sleeping ward, she found a folded piece of paper tucked under the blanket in the bassinet. It was small, creased, damp at the edges. Just one sentence, written in uneven handwriting. You weren't alone. She held the paper to her chest and stared into the dark. The next morning, a social worker came by, spoke gently, offered a place to stay. No pressure, just a chance, a start. The mother listened. She didn't know what she would say or what would come next. The world outside still felt dangerous, the future uncertain. But in that moment, sitting in a hospital gown with her son in her arms and a stranger's kindness tucked into her hand, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Stillness, not peace, not yet. But the quiet between storms, the breath before the climb. She looked down at her son, whose fingers were now curled into tiny fists against her chest. She whispered his name, the one she had chosen while bleeding on the church floor, afraid she would never speak again. He shifted slightly in her arms. She smiled just once. Outside the window, the morning light crept in, slow and soft. It filled the room with warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. No miracles, no heroes. Just a stranger who stayed long enough to make a difference, and a mother who survived long enough to begin again. And in that quiet somewhere deep inside the silence, the last prayer she had whispered into the rafters of a broken church was finally answered.